Hello and welcome to this virtual session. We're glad you can join us today. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items we'd like to go over with you now. Firstly, you can resize the webinar windows to cater to your viewing preferences. You can maximise, minimise and drag the windows to your preferred viewing size. If you look at the bottom middle of your screen, you can click on the widgets that you'll need to get the most out of this virtual experience. Secondly, Microsoft specialists are on hand to answer your questions in real time. So feel free to type in your questions using the Q&A window and we'll answer them as soon as we can. Lastly, we've provided some additional resources for you to supplement your learning. You can access them by clicking on the links in this section. Without further ado, I'll hand over to our speakers.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name's Matt Hester. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer here in Worldwide Learning. I'm excited over the next two parts. We're going to learn all about Azure Migrate, but a little bit about myself. I currently live in McKinney, Texas, which is a northern suburb of Dallas, but I was born in Ohio. I'm a proud Buckeyes and Browns fan, as you may see on my laptop lid. I sometimes have stickers that are there. I have many certifications. I've been with Microsoft proudly over 21 years. I've been a Microsoft certified trainer for 25 years, and my very first certification, might date me a bit, was NT351. So I've been around this industry for quite some time, and I've just been blessed with my opportunities. And the main reason why I do all of this is my family. I've been blessed with three amazing kids, Nicole, Mitchell, and Caitlin. And I'm not supposed to say this, but Nicole and Mitchell would say Caitlin, my young child under the sign that says Forever Bledsoe, is probably my favorite. Nicole and Mitchell would agree with me on this. Very proud of my daughter, Nicole. She's getting ready to graduate college. She's going to be a math teacher. My son just got into college. He currently stands at 6'7". Fun thing about my son this year, he actually dunked me in the pool and I couldn't stop it. And as a dad, that was kind of a humbling moment. And I just looked at him and proudly smiled. I said, well, son, I'm so proud of you, and gave him a high five and was congratulatory. I said, but now you get old man fighting style. And he's like, what's that? And I pinched him, I screamed a little bit, and then I dunked him. It was awesome, but he now knows the rules have changed forever for us, but I'm very proud of him. He plays volleyball. So excited for him. I have been blessed with a wife, amazing wife, Kristen. We're both Stars fans, so I do have a little bit of Dallas fandom in me, even though I'm primarily a Buckeye and a Brown. It's there. And then as you can kind of see, I have a wonderful fur baby in Coda Maya. Those are my main reasons why I do this job and why I'm so excited to be a part of this training over the next two parts. I'd like to welcome you to this Microsoft Azure Virtual Training Day. We're going to be migrating on-premises infrastructure and data events that will cover 5 modules in 2 parts. In part 1 of this event, we're going to cover the first 3 modules in the course. We begin with Module 1, which you're going to hear this word a lot. Plan, 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 plan. We're going to plan, and we're going to talk about assessment for cloud migrations. When we move into Module 2, we're going to discuss Windows Server compute migration, moving VMs. We wrap up Part 1 with Module 3, choosing the right strategy for SQL servers and applications. What makes this interesting is the choices of where you have your landing zone for SQL. And in Part 2, we're going to start with Module 4, and we're going to finish that story of migrating SQL workloads in Azure. And then we're going to wrap up with Module 5, where we're going to talk about how to protect, manage, monitor, and optimize workloads in Azure, and really focus on Azure Active Directory. Welcome to Module 1, where we're going to talk about planning and assessment for cloud migrations. And quite frankly, over the next 5 parts of this series, this is probably the most important thing you have to do when you're migrating your assets from on-prem to the cloud or for hybrid. You got to get the planning right. Just like they always say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail inside of it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a fictitious company throughout this series called Smart Hotel, and we're going to take some web apps that are running in IIS and some SQL instances, and we're going to migrate them with a variety of tools into Azure. And we're going to set up some hybrid workloads as well. So it's really exciting, but it all starts once again with that planning process. And the first decision you have to make whenever you're planning to move something inside of Azure is, am I going to move it completely into Azure? Am I going completely just to the cloud? cloud. In other words, I'm going to get everything that's running on-prem and just move it directly into the cloud. I'm going to take it just all lock, stock, and barrel and move it up. Or am I trying to get away from maybe on-prem Active Directory domain services? Remember our old domain controllers of old? Maybe we want to move those, and how do we move our identity? Because we have to think about, hey, when we move workloads into the cloud, how are we going to log on for authentication and authorization when we need to access those resources? And what is going to be that final destination? What are we going to put on those different operating systems? What needs to be there? Is it going to look exactly the same as it did on-prem, which we'd call a lift and shift migration? We're simply lifting it the way it looks like here, and we're shifting it into the cloud. Or are we going to do some other refactoring or re-architecting? These are decisions you have to make. Or do we say, you know what? I don't want to go all in with the cloud, but I need to have part of it run on-prem. I want to move some of the workloads that support my applications to Azure. Maybe I have my existing domain services that I need to keep intact for whatever reason, maybe compliance, maybe there's an application on-prem that needs it, and I need to have hybrid identity. Do I need to move just some of it? Do I want to use things like Azure Stack, which is basically a really big piece of hardware that we can run on-prem that helps us mitigate some of those download taxes, gives us some basically Azure resources on-prem, but we still need to connect to the cloud for those finalized resources. And really, when we start thinking about this, are we just have to have something on-prem for whatever reason? Maybe it's running on legacy hardware, a legacy operating system. Maybe we have to have something that's on-prem because we need to. And generally what we see at Microsoft with that is, you know what? Most likely compliance or regulatory reasons. And so we have a really big decision first. Do you want to go all in with the cloud, or you want to go hybrid? I want to keep one foot on-prem because I need to, and one foot in the cloud because that's what we have to set things up. So your first conversation, whenever you're looking at your workloads, where's it going to go? Where am I going to put it? Have that educated conversation, all right? The best part that we can offer you at Microsoft, and I'm going to show you a wonderful website here in just a moment, is we actually have a cloud adoption framework, a series of best practices that we put together talking to customers like yourselves, saying, hey, what's the best way? Mr. or Mrs. Customer, you move from on-prem into the cloud, and how do we do it? Notice the first step. Define the strategy. Understand, what are we trying to do? You know, whenever people talk about the cloud, there's only two fundamental reasons they go to the cloud: to support a business objective that they can't really do easily on-prem, and or to help save some money on expenses. Those are the two reasons. So define what is driving your adoption of cloud. Know what your motivation is. And that way you can move into that cloud. And then you start planning it. You start talking about, hey, what is my digital footprint or my digital estate going to look like? How do I have my organization aligned? And sometimes what's really interesting about this, people forget about these last two parts: readiness plans. Just because your business is all in, yeah, we got to move for this business application to the cloud. Do you have the people in your organization that can do it, that can handle that migration, that understand Azure so that when you do move it, they can run it efficiently? Better yet, can they optimize it, make it run even better when they move it to the cloud? So you have to have that readiness as a part of that plan and have that a part of your adoption plan, because we're changing fundamentally where things are located. Now, granted, it's still in Azure, and if you do a lift and shift, some of that readiness is still baked in, but they have to know how to get to those resources. How do we set these things up? You know, if you never work with Azure, what's that look like? How do you get things up and running? What's going to be your first workload that you're going to move, your first kind of area that you're going to create? We call landing zones. And what are some best practices for that? And then how do we adopt that? How do we migrate those tools? How do we innovate this? I can guarantee you one thing. When you move your workloads to the cloud and you do that migration process, somewhere, sometime along the way, maybe an hour after you migrate, maybe a month after you migrate, maybe a year after you migrate, somebody's going to say, you know what, we're in Azure, and they have this other feature over here that can do the same thing we're doing here. Can we migrate that? Can we innovate it? Can we leverage all these cloud benefits to make our life easier and more efficient in the cloud? The great thing about this, guess what? We still have to govern all this. We still have to have methodology so people put things in the right way. Azure provides just a boatload of technologies to make sure that when we put resources into the cloud that we still stay in compliance. We have this wonderful thing called Azure Policy, which is basically your deny button. If your users, and I always joke when I talk about governance with my students, how many times have you ever read the README file? In your organization, you have this file called README that tells you the organizational guidelines. Nobody ever reads the README file. But what if I told you in Azure we really don't have to, because when we migrate, we can set policies in effect that say, you know what? These resources need to go into the West region. They can't have a public IP address. We can control the creation of resources to make sure when we're building stuff, we don't build things accidentally out of compliance. And then how do we manage this? How do we monitor this? Throughout the entire life cycle of this process, you have to have those two big pillars always. Hey, what's our governance going to look like and how are we going to manage it? Readiness is a part of that. Having a definitive plan is a part of that as well. And so we have this framework that helps document all these strategies of how we look at the business strategies. And we're going to look at all these kind of individually here in a second. But the one thing I want to show you is there's a wonderful website, and I want to take you to that website right now so you can actually take a look at it. It's the Cloud Adoption Framework website. And the great thing about this website is that it gives you all the documentation that you can look at. Now, I know what you're thinking as you see all these links going, Matt, that's a lot of stuff. Yep, it is a lot of stuff. This is a big deal. I would love to say migrations are always easy and simple. You might, well, I only got this little server here. Well, you may not have much workload, but you got to treat it the same as if you have 1,000 servers versus 1 server versus 10 servers. You want to treat them all the same. And the cool thing about it, we provide a lot of documentation. And by the way, this is an evolving document to help you solve these problems. And so this website is something you really want to get used to because it's going to help you as you plan that migration into Azure. So the Cloud Adoption Framework is just an amazing area for you to learn and grow from. So something you want to get used to. You want to bookmark that page, go to it right now. I know the link's already been up on the screen, probably there right now. Just bookmark it and have something to go back and refer to. It's going to help you no matter what workload you're going to be migrating into Azure. So back into our slides for a second here as we come in through this module. So have these plans in place, have this entire framework and methodology. Here's the best thing about it. I just gave you kind of Microsoft's best practices of how we look at cloud adoption. Make this framework work for you and your organization. You want to be able to design something that, kind of adheres to some of these principles because they're very sound principles. A lot of our customers, to our large enterprise customers, to our smaller customers, and everybody in between, guess what? They do these types of things. They go through this thoughtful methodology planning, especially if you want to be successful. Oftentimes when we have customers that don't follow some kind of methodology or they ask us, hey, we tried to migrate something and we just kind of just went right after it, they fail. Why? They didn't have a solid plan. So that framework's going to help you have that plan. Whenever you start talking about the landing zones with this plan, the first thing you want to talk about is how do we get our Azure? How do we have our tenants set up for our directories and for our identity environment? Are we a multi-tenant company? In other words, we've grown through acquisition, and you might have acquired companies that already had an Azure landing zone. How do we make those work? How do we bring our identity into play? And I'll tell you, probably one of the most exciting things that all of our customers take advantage of, even if they don't use Azure, is identity platform. Identity and Azure Identity, specifically Azure Active Directory, has been around since the Office 365 days. It's always been there. And the cool thing about that identity, when you get this right, you get a centralized identity that allows your management, it allows your access and control. It's all centralized in Azure AD, all right? Especially when you're using Azure, this is baked into this. But we have customers that use Azure, they use AWS, they use Google, they use multiple clouds. Well, guess what? You can still use Azure Active Directory as your identity platform. There is no need, if you already have it in place, to bring in those other environments. Network topology and connectivity. I struggle with this one because, enterprise enrollment, we first have to have something. Identity, we have to know how to log on. I think this one should be the first. Now, I'm an infrastructure guy, right? So network topology and connectivity is probably the most important thing you have to plan for when you're creating your Azure environment. What is my network going to look like? Am I going to do a hub and spoke topology where I have one network that's kind of the central of everything and everybody are just spokes like a bicycle wheel off of it that we connect into the hub and then we can get to those other spokes? Why do we do hub and spoke? We want to avoid number of hops, but we still want to control that. How am I going to connect from on-prem into Azure? So I have this huge network topology. Now, how do I connect from on-prem? Do I want to go over the internet and use something like site-to-site VPNs? Or do I want to go direct with ExpressRoute where I have a direct connection? These are decisions you need to make. Because if you get this right, the rest is just a matter of how am I going to move the workloads. Having that connectivity plan, having that topology plan in place is hugely important. Because if you get that wrong, you might have to redesign your entire network, which means you might have to redesign that entire area. The cool thing about this, when you're building that landing zone, you haven't even started migrating anything right. So get your network and topology right. Have your resource organization, have the right subscriptions. And this one, I don't have a good answer for you. People say, Matt, how should I get multiple subscriptions or multiple resource groups? What should I do? I don't know. It depends. It depends on what your organization's set up. Are you going to give, every time you have a new solution, just have a new subscription that we manage? Or are we going to give them a new resource group? It's really up to your organization, but have that in place. Have your governance in place. How are things supposed to look like? Because the one thing about this is that Azure, if we are out of compliance on-prem and you do a lift and shift, you're now out of compliance in the cloud. So migrating to Azure can help you fix a lot of those things that we may not have been able to get to on-prem. But have that strategy. Have a baseline. What does it look like? Oftentimes when people move things to the cloud, they think, hey, look, why isn't it running faster? What's going on? Well, did you know what it looked like on-prem? What was the speed it ran with on-prem? And what's that speed going to look like when we have it in Azure? You have to create those baselines for that monitoring environment so we can really look at that information. And then we want to have business continuity and disaster recovery. I don't know if this is a secret or not, but let me just pull you in for a second. Azure runs on hardware. All cloud technologies is hardware somewhere. And we know that sometimes hardware can fail, or our solutions fail, or a service stops running. How are you designing your solution to take advantage of what's built into Azure for business continuity and disaster recovery? And whenever I look at these topics, I get very passionate about them because we can design a lot of that business continuity so we don't have to use disaster recovery technologies. We don't have to go to backups or Azure Site Recovery. And granted, it's not, by the way, I want to be very clear. I did not say don't use these. We still have to set them up. They still have to be in place, right? Because we don't want to lose something. But at the same time, if you do really good on business continuity, when you have to use those tools when they're recovered, it won't be as bad. Because business continuity, being able to keep our systems up and running as we're deploying them into Azure is something you need to think about. Deployment options. What tool is the best tool? We love our partners. Our partners have a truckload of tools, and you'll see them in a few slides throughout these modules. We're going to focus on the Azure tools for deployment. The Azure migration tools. We actually have robust tool sets for moving any one of those workloads, web servers, just a server in general, a database server, even potentially moving your applications or your web applications. We have robust tool sets. But you know what? We know some of you use your partner tools and you're using them today for something else. The cool thing about doing any of this, we do recommend that you do bring in some help. You do bring in some kind of consulting or a partner to help you have those decisions. Yeah, you're going to have to pay for that. I understand that. But when you're deploying it, it's nice to have a paid-for, unbiased opinion of what's the best way to move those workloads, because we all get passionate about the stuff when we're migrating them. The tool that you're going to see throughout these modules is a tool called Azure Migrate. This is our centralized hub for everything. When you're migrating your on-prem servers and your applications to Azure, this is where you're going to go. And you're going to see this throughout the modules. It's called Azure Migrate. Now, I say that and I smile because I already know the last module we're going to cover is on Azure Active Directory and setting that up. Guess what? It's not an Azure Migrate. That's actually an Azure directory. And the main reason it's not is the very important concept that most of you are familiar with. We have our tenants, which include our Azure Active Directory environment, essentially where our identity is. Tenants also have some other security settings. They do some governance, entire directory-wide settings. But that's where our identity lives. And that's where we migrate to. We migrate to Azure Active Directory. Azure Migrate lives in the subscription. Whenever I think of subscriptions, I think of solutions. And this is where you're going to build your stuff. So it makes sense that we have two tools to help us migrate our identity for our directory, which lives in the tenant. And we have another tool that's going to migrate our solutions called Azure Migrate that's going to migrate them into our actual subscription. So we're going to see both throughout these 5 parts today, but that's the main tool. And this tool, I'm telling you what, it's like a Swiss Army knife of what do you want to do today? How do you want to migrate those tools? How do you want to set them up? We have assessment tools where we can actually load tools on-prem that will assess our environments. We're going to see those in Module 2 when we're assessing our virtual servers. We're going to look at a Hyper-V host and see how all those servers come up and for us to look at. We have migration tools that leverage those assessments to move things in environment. Now, in our demos that we're going to see, I'm using Hyper-V, of course, but guess what? These could be VMware. These could be physical servers. These could be Windows servers. They could be Linux servers. Oh, and by the way, you can move this from other cloud servers. You can move these from other cloud services like AWS or GCP. You can migrate these tools into Azure. So if you need to move something from your other cloud platform into Azure, these same tools are kind of server agnostic. They don't really care where they are. They just care how they're going to get them to where they need to be inside of Azure. We also have a tool that we're going to see in Module 3 and 4 called the Database Migration Assistant. How do we move databases from on-prem? And databases are always a very interesting conversation for me because when we talk about moving databases into Azure, it's how do we move the data? That's part one, but wait, where's the application that's using that data? How do we thoughtfully think of this? So that application may be running in a server that we're going to be migrating at the same time we're migrating the data. Well, which one do we do first? Have a plan. We talked about that a lot in the beginning of this module. Have a plan for that migration, and you won't go wrong. So we have the DMA to help us through moving that schema, moving the database into Azure, to give us that plan. But then this is the other reason why I like this conversation. Where are you going to put the database? In Azure, we actually have 3 ways you can move SQL from on-prem into Azure. You can move it into a VM. So in other words, we install a VM. We have SQL running in that VM. We can move it into Azure SQL Database, which is a PaaS offering, which is just a database in the cloud. And then we have kind of the in-between between the SQL database and the SQL Azure VM called the Azure SQL Managed Instances. And the cool thing about the managed instances, guess what? They allow us to kind of have a hybrid environment, and it's all about control. And we're going to talk about that in our database modules in Module 3 and 4. That's going to be a recurring theme of when you're going to move SQL, where do you move it into? We have Move Air to assess servers. Those are one of our tools that we can use. We have the Web App Migration Assistant. If we want to just move the web apps from on-prem and migrate them in either .NET and PHP. Now, if you're new to Azure, and this is the first time you're hearing a Microsoft person talk about Azure, yes, I just said PHP. Microsoft and Azure has been designed to be heterogeneous at nature. We don't care what your workload runs on-prem. Azure, chances are, speaks those languages or speaks that database technology. Yeah, in our modules, we're going to focus on a lot of our Microsoft technologies, but fundamentally, any of these tools work exactly the same way. Now, I know what you're thinking. Matt, these are great. We've set up our great network. We have a lot of high speed, but I need to move terabytes or petabytes of data. How do I get that data into Azure? We actually have a solution called Azure Data Box. Now, this is a solution where we actually can take drives that you borrow essentially from us. And I said borrow, I'll get to that in just a moment. And you can put all your data on the drives and essentially mail the drives back to the Azure region and to the data centers of where you're going to have that recovery. And when you need to migrate large amounts of data, we do recommend customers use Data Box or maybe use your own drives to get the data. And we have some documentation around that because you are talking about petabytes of data. And even if you have ExpressRoute, upping that across your pipe, which you can do, still might take time. And so it all depends on, once again, what that plan says. How do we need to get the data there? What's the best way to get those data in? So we have ways to migrate that data as well. So hopefully we got an idea of what we're going to look at over the next four modules of what migration is going to look like. And we're going to see all those tools as we go through it. But one thing I like to cover here is myths. I want to clear up some things. And whenever we talk about moving the cloud, a lot of things that people think are true may not be true, but it also depends on what we're coming from and looking at it from a context of the overall scheme of migration. Is it cheaper to go to the cloud? That's a myth. Everything should go into the cloud. We've already talked about that's probably not the case for your organizations. Mirroring the on-prem environment will help you save money in the cloud. Well, I don't know if that's a good idea either, but how many times have you heard that? Server costs drive business cases for cloud migrations. Cost is an important part of why people move to cloud. And quite frankly, folks, if cloud wasn't saving people money, if it wasn't one of the drivers for this, chances are we may not be moving to cloud, right? Cost isn't the only option, though. People move to cloud for business problems. One of my favorite case studies of all time, and you can look it up. It's just a wonderful case study. It's about Azure and rhinoceroses. Yes, I said rhinoceroses and Azure in the same sentence. We actually have a Peace Parks Foundation in South Africa that uses IoT device cameras that are motion activated that sends a picture to Azure to go through machine learning to see if a rhinoceros is in danger, that if a poacher has come into the park to go after the rhinoceroses. Guess what they couldn't have done on-prem? They couldn't have built that solution. They didn't really care about cost because they didn't have something they were coming from. Costs don't drive that decision. Business drives that decision. And so when we talk about costs, I always think about my friends, the cute and cuddly rhinoceroses. Why? Because that solution couldn't have been built on-prem for what they're doing. Just think about the amount of data that's on a 96,000 hectare park. That's a lot of data. Cost can't be your only driver. The business has to be the driver. And hopefully along the way, you save some money. This one's probably my favorite. One of the fundamental tenets of cloud model is that we go from a capital expense. So on-prem, when you buy hardware, it's a capital expenditure. That hardware is on your book. And we go to operational expense. We're going to talk more about that. Is operational expense better? I don't know. That's a myth, though, because we'll tell you that. Moving the cloud is simple as flipping a switch. Hopefully you already know, guess what? That's not the case, all right? First off, the cloud is cheaper. When we think about this, it's really about looking at our different environments that we define. Do you have cloud governance in place? You know, if we're just migrating, once again, what do we talk about? Governance and management are the underlying pillars that are a part of your planning process all the way through assessment and migration. Well, if we don't do that, then we're letting customers move things into the cloud with no governance and no effective way to make sure that we're saving money. One of my favorite stories, we had customers that were like this, especially early in the days. And this particular customer, when we looked at how they were using Azure, they had over 1,000 different VMs they were putting inside the cloud. Well, we came in with some simple governance technologies. We came in with using hybrid licensing models as well, to actually to save on that licensing benefit inside of Azure. And that same customer, because they put a little governance after the fact, saved about $300,000 a year. So initially it was more expensive because they didn't have any governance. So governance is important. Having your architecture aligned. So when we take a look at this, when we're aligning those applications, do we move the VM hosting the code? So if I move the VM, that's just hosting a little bit of code, is that the best way to do it? Well, maybe for readiness or maybe for efficiency and speed, but long term, you should be thinking about, hey, is that server important or do I just need the code? And if I just need the code, can I take that code off that server and maybe put it into a container service or just put it natively into a function? What do I do? All right. So when we start talking about, is it always cheaper? It all depends on how you're migrating. What kind of plan have you put in place? Do we have process duplication? You know, we have redundancy on-prem. We do a lot of things to help protect against rack failures and data center failures and regional failures, that kind of stuff. Well, if you move it into the cloud, there's a lot of inherent benefits that cloud just gives you by moving to the cloud. For example, everything that we store inside of Azure, like for your hard drives, for your VMs, or your blobs and your containers, inside of Azure, you get 3 copies. You only pay for 1, but you get 3 copies of data. Why? If we have a drive failure, if a drive just goes clicky, all of a sudden it doesn't work, guess what? We already have it there. So do you need to migrate all that cluster for storage in the cloud? Probably not. Unusual system configurations. When you have custom hardware and you migrate things to Azure, Azure's going to try to make a guess based on what it sees. Is that the best guess? And here's the cool thing about it. You won't know that right away unless you're monitoring the server and understand what the baseline is. All right? Understanding what that server looks like and how do we run. And so all of a sudden, if you migrate this custom server and you look at the monitoring and the server's processor is only at 20% utilization, well, you're paying for a lot more than what you're using. So can we use a smaller VM? All right? You wouldn't know that unless you had a baseline and a monitor. Oh, staffing costs. Hiring employees with cloud experience. This is all about readiness, folks. If you don't help your team work with that, and that's what's cool about the team that I'm on now at Microsoft. My job, train customers to help you be successful with Azure. All right? Get trained, hire the people. But it also means, hey, do we need to hire developers if we're building an app, or can we buy an app? Maybe there's a SaaS offering that does the same thing. So is it always cheaper? Depends on what you're looking at, how that plan comes in. Everything should go to the cloud. No, not everything should go to the cloud, right? First off, compliancy. You might have simple rules around, hey, you know what? We have to have an Azure data center in a certain country or region. Early on in the days of Azure, we had no Canadian regions. So a lot of our Canadian customers did not use Azure because they didn't want to go into the US for compliancy reasons. And it was perfectly acceptable, right? So maybe I can't move certain workloads. Maybe I have traffic patterns that I have to worry about. When you're looking at a large amount of data transfer, maybe there is too much. Now, I will tell you from a data transfer, I don't see this as much once everything's in the cloud. I see it more from a standpoint when you're in hybrid cloud mode. And you have to mitigate. If you're downloading large amounts of data, you have to put in some kind of devices like Store Simple. We have lots of partners that do these types of things, Veeam, Zerto, just a ton of different partners. You have to put something on-prem to help mitigate that download tax as you download those large files, right? Because downloading a terabyte from the cloud, it's the math problem, right? It's a timing problem. What's your available bandwidth? How does that work? How do we set those things up? Those are all factors into this. Do we need to re-architect our app? This is the biggest thing. When you start looking at your applications, we have applications that run on specific hardware, and maybe that hardware or operating system is not supported by Azure. How do we move that to the cloud? Well, maybe you can't. Maybe because Azure doesn't support it, we can't move it. But here's the cool thing, folks. I don't know if it's a cool thing, but it's something you should think about. You know what? If I'm still running NT4.0 on-prem, and hopefully I'm not speaking to you right now, but if I just drew somebody in, yeah, I still got some on NT4.0, let me just remind you, it's not supported anymore. And so that app you are running is no longer on a supported operating system, which could put you out of compliance of whatever you're trying to do. So do I want to move the NT4.0 server to Azure? One, you can't. But two, that's not the conversation. That application's doing something. Can I redesign it in Azure using resources that are in compliance that are fully supported? So when you look about applications, do we need to re-architect it before we move it? Okay. Mirroring the on-prem. Yeah, I want to make everything look identical, what's here on-prem in the cloud. And that's a mega lift and shift that's not realistic, right? The main reason why is that when you look at your organization, and be honest with yourself, when you look at all the servers that you're using in the organization, all the servers that are in the server closets, that are in the data centers, that are even potentially underneath somebody's desk, hopefully not, do you want to migrate all that? Do you want to move all that data in? No. Because chances are they're inefficient. There were some studies that were done back a few years ago that found that 30% of your servers on the average are no longer being used. All they are is they're on and taking up power. There's no earthly reason you would ever migrate those to Azure. Matter of fact, this is one thing that says, hey, we'll save you money, but even if you don't migrate, folks, take an honest look at your on-prem server footprint and get rid of those servers if you don't need them. Every workload doesn't need to be moved to the cloud. You got to look at real utilization. Or looking at, hey, is there an Azure resource that can cover that we're already using and leverage? My favorite is identity. If you're looking at, if you have your on-prem domain controllers and you have applications that require Kerberos and some of the very specific things that we don't offer in Azure with Azure AD natively, we do have a service called Azure Active Directory Domain Services that we'll look at in Module 5 that can give you some of that same functionality for that reason to move some of those workloads. But I would argue if you have workloads still leveraging that domain for that, can you re-architect the app to move it into a modern application in the world? Server costs drive business cases. We talked quite about this. They don't. Costs are a part of that. I would say cost is the benefit. If you look thoughtfully at the cloud, at moving this environment, you're going to want to look at what is the business benefit? What can I do? And I talked about the rhinoceroses. There was a business benefit they couldn't even do on-prem. Do they necessarily care how much it's going to cost to save a rhinoceros? They probably care about how they monitor and have that environment taken to its fullest potential, but guess what? They're saving rhinoceroses. That drove the entire decision. The price didn't. And chances are, especially when you look at this, and this is a very popular conversation we have, especially in our Azure fundamental classes, is the first time you look at a VM inside of Azure, if you're just doing a lift and shift, and you go, wait a second, whoa, that's going to cost me how much per month? If I multiply that by 12, I can go buy 10 of those and run them on-prem, and that's how I can get across it. Well, if sticker price gets you, understand, folks, there's a cost to run things inside of Azure. But you know what? You got to look at the total cost of ownership, because when customers get into that siloed thinking where they're thinking just server hardware and licensing, when that server's running on-prem, there's a lot more costs that go on with that server. There is heating, there's cooling, there's power, there's the building it lives in, there's the people that have to maintain those servers. So you have to look at the total cost of ownership of that entire environment, because when you move it to Azure, all that hardware stuff is all included into those prices. And so you got to take a really thoughtful look. And we do have a TCO calculator. And some customers, it comes out and says, hey, this is going to save you a lot of money. Some customers says it's going to save you a little money. And some customers says, you know what? Not the best choice just yet. Okay, this is how we want to look at these environments. And that also factors into when you look at when things go down, how do we deal with those costs? We have some wonderful technologies to make sure things are always available inside of Azure, especially when you look at the elasticity of Azure. And elasticity is one of my favorite things. You might know this as scaling, and we have horizontal scaling, we have vertical scaling, so we can scale out or scale in, or we can scale up or we can scale down. The one thing you can't do on-prem, you can scale up, you can't scale down. You can scale out, but you can't scale in. Because think about this, if you're on-prem and you have a seasonal part of your business, like maybe you have the brand new widget that everybody wants, well, you're going to get a lot more workload. Well, if you try to solve the problem on-prem, you're stuck with all those servers, right? Do we need to migrate all those servers to cloud? No, absolutely not. Why? Because the cloud, what we can do is take advantage of elasticity. We can grow and shrink those needs. Because on-prem, you can scale out, but you're now stuck with all those servers. What do you do with them? All right. Real estate and facilities, we talked about the cost there as well. Really important to look at the total cost of ownership. Oh, OpEx is better than CapEx. We've heard this before. And when I look at this, this is a big driver. A lot of customers, and quite frankly, the OpEx model is fitting into a lot of businesses and how we design things, and it should be an advantage for you. But when you start thinking about how long do you keep servers on the average, and if you have contracts that say, hey, we have to run this server for the next 10 years, there is a break-even point for your organization where the CapEx model might be more benefits to your company. But you still have assets on the book that are depreciating over time, and eventually with capital expenditure, that depreciation becomes so minimal. It's like if you own a car and you get that last car payment, now you have a car you don't have a car payment for. Kind of the same thing with servers, but normally that's a long tail. That's 10 years with servers. How often do you migrate your servers? Most customers on the average every 5 years. So the op model might help you, but if you have those servers for a while, we might want to look at this. We also have a lot of accounting issues around this that customers are starting to look at. Hey, look, we get that operations extensive model is how Azure's built and how it's set up, but the solutions that we build in Azure do have a lifespan. They're going to have to be changed every 4 or 5 years. So how do we treat those solutions as capital expenditures inside of an operating expense model? And a lot of customers are looking at the accounting principles to make that happen. But once again, this is all about cost. Operating expense should be a benefit for your organization, but you got to really look at how those industries work and how they bring that data forward. And so when we look at organizations having a capital influx, they might have a lot of money, but that's what makes cloud attractive. Especially if you're a young startup company, you don't have any capital expenditure, you're just starting. Cloud makes it efficient to move because you have operating expenses. So once again, if you have companies that are looking at those, they want higher sales margins, they have certain capital influx, or they have a long tail on hardware, might be reasons why capital expenditure is going to be better than operational expenditure. That's one really key myth. A lot of it's in the accountant's hands on this one, but it's something to consider as we go through this. Hopefully you know this isn't the case. This should never be a myth. And if anybody from Microsoft ever came up and said, you know what, moving to cloud is easy, it just turn a switch, I am sorry. It is not easy, all right? You want to look at these things. You want to, they're intense. They're manual for some of these processes. Although we can automate a lot of it, we still want to look at this. You might have bandwidth limitations. You might have testing timelines, migration timelines. These things aren't easy. You can make them easier with, say it with me, a plan. You can mitigate this. You can make it easy, but it's not easy. Right? Because you have to thoughtfully plan. I'll tell you what, when you look at the technologies of moving things in the cloud, those actually are kind of easy. But you know what? They're only easy because you spent the diligence to create that plan to make those tools. You already knew what those tools were going to do before you even turned them on. Right? So have that idea of what's going on. Have a timeline to mitigate these strategies. Looking at what are some technical adoption constraints? We have customers that say, hey, we can't move to the cloud until Microsoft comes out with that feature that's currently in preview. And that's 100%. Or we have like our Canadian friends before there were Canadian data centers, right? Hey, we got to move stuff inside of here. Identify who are the key stakeholders to help you engage that environment. Who's going to do this? And especially if they're resistant to change, talk to them. You know, I don't know if it's a sad thing or a good thing or a bad thing. Because when you get people that are passionate saying, I'm not ever going to move to the cloud, you'll probably never change their opinion. But something will happen down the line. And most customers that I hear make that statement, I'm just not going to move to the cloud. 4 or 5 years later, after talking to those customers, I wish we'd have moved sooner. You have to have those people and have that very honest conversation with them about why looking at cloud technologies is important. You know, one of my kind of good, bad stories that we had some customers that were impacted by Hurricane Matthew several years ago, really bad hurricane that hit Florida. But we had partners working with those customers, and these were small businesses. And one of the businesses was really impacted by Hurricane Matthew. They were literally underwater. And they were a small business. But this partner was thoughtful enough that they had already backed up their data to the cloud. So they kept everything running on-prem. Their backups were in the cloud. But if their infrastructure is underwater, where do they restore to? This partner acted quickly enough and was able to spin up VMs in the cloud to restore the backups so the business could run with virtual machines inside of Azure. Why? They didn't have physical servers, and that saved that small business. All right. So when we look at these things, understand those key stakeholders. These are things. It's not meant to scare people, and I don't want it to be that way. But you got to honestly look at it. What are the benefits for this, and what are the benefits to your business, and have that candid conversation. Go through that process. Bring in consultants if you need to work inside of it. Okay. Speaking of partners, we have a really good program called the Azure Migration and Modernization Program, AMMP. AMP. You could say AMP. And you add the extra M, but it's really how do you amp up your migrations? It helps you move confidently. Why? Because you're getting help. This is the point where you're admitting, I don't know how to do this, or I want to make sure this gets done right. And my folks that in my organization are really smart, they're really good, but they need some help to get up to speed into Azure. We have fast track support for Azure. It's for Azure support. It's a Microsoft offering. We have our partners out there that have to adhere to lots of certifications to be a Microsoft partner. There's hundreds of these in the world. Technical skilling, getting ready. That's what my team does. Making sure that you're giving us training. Oh, by the way, depending on your organization, folks, some of the training that we offer at Microsoft might be free for you. Might be free. Look into that. Talk to your account teams, right? Chances are you're going to get some skilling that should be easy. But once again, when we're talking about migration, yeah, you're going to have to pay somebody to help you with this, but they might bring their own tools. Guess what? It's a paid, unbiased opinion. They're going to help solve your problems for your best interests at heart. Not some internal politics, not some people saying, no, I don't want it to happen. And you might be thinking, that never happens in my organization. I have worked with customers where they were actively sabotaging the migration. It happens, folks. Bring somebody in to help mitigate that. Bring somebody in to help move that information forward into Azure. When you look at all these scenarios, they do everything. The AMP program will look at all your infrastructure. It'll look at your virtual desktop infrastructure. If you're using things like VDI today, how do you move them forward? We'll do app and data modernization. Part of that conversation as you move your applications and data, what's the best way to move that? How do we re-architect or refactor that application into Azure? We have some really nice tools to make this work for you to your benefit. So the cool thing about this is having those tools in those places in your wheelhouse allows you to make this in a real thoughtful way. And moving that entire infrastructure and database from on-prem into cloud or from other clouds and moving it over, now it's just a matter of using the tools. The tools are relatively easy to use. They take time when they're doing discovery, of course, but they're relatively straightforward. Once again, mapping back to that plan, what's going to be the best way. So as we close out this module, that first word, can't stress it enough to you. A well-planned cloud migration is going to be more successful than just winging it, than just saying, you know what, we can move to Azure, right? I think the only time I've ever seen an ad hoc where they had one server and they said, you know, I'm going to move that server to the cloud. That's kind of a plan, right? Not totally ad hoc, but plan. Okay, Azure Migrate, the tool set that you're going to see throughout the next 4 parts, you're going to see just has an amazing set of tools, not only to assess, but also to migrate and get you thinking about how those tools are going to be moved. Rationalize your workloads, look at them. Cost is not the driver here, business is the driver. How can I move those apps? Do I want to containerize the apps? Do I want to move the application off the VM? Well, my favorite one here is file servers. Let me ask you a question about moving file servers. Do you care about the OS on the file server? Or you care just about the files? Well then, why are you moving the entire file server when we have services to help do that? All right? So when you look at those workloads, understand what you're running on-prem. Articles prove it. Studies have proven it. 30% of your stuff not being used. Ensure you're prepared. So part of it is having an honest assessment of on-prem, having a plan, and now, hey, we're going to go use Azure. We like the migration environment. We have to set it up. Be thoughtful about that preparation. You should plan your Azure landing environment just as much as you plan the migration and the assessments. And then use the Azure Migration and Modernization programs to help understand what's the best way to move the workload. And it might say lift and shift. It might say just move that file share into our file services. It might say move that application into Azure Functions or one of the other plethora of PaaS services we have. Understand what that program is designed to do is, once again, do we need to move that whole server? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on what's happening there. So we're going to see, and I'm excited for the next 4 modules, you're going to see all these tools in action. We're going to move VMs, we're going to move databases, we're going to assess all of it. We're even going to have some fun with identity. In Module 1, we saw a lot of great technologies, and we heard that word planning a lot. And really, that's the key to any successful migration is planning. We talked about the myths of migration and how when you really start to migrate workloads, you want to take a really healthy look and assess what you have on-prem before you move it to the cloud to have a successful migration. And we really focus on the cloud adoption framework in Module 1. Now let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll see you back in just a few minutes.